Let's talk about the anatomy of the arm from the front, starting with our skeletal structures. So first of all, we have our clavicle. Then we have our acromion process. These are two things we already talked about when we talked about the anatomy of the torso. Then we have the scapula. Now keep in mind, we're looking at the scapula as if the rib cage is missing. Now on the scapula we have a few little details. This little bump right here is an extension of the scapular spine. And then this little bump right here is called the coracoid process. It's an important little bump in the anatomy of the upper arm. So we'll talk about that in a second. We have the shoulder socket, our glenoid cavity. And then we have the humerus itself. And a couple of details on the humerus. So this little bump right here is called the deltoid tuberosity. That's the insertion point of the deltoid. And then we have two bumps, the lateral epicondyle on the outside of the humerus and the medial epicondyle on the inside of the humerus. You might be familiar with the medial epicondyle because that's the location of the funny bone, the nerve that really hurts when you bump it. Then in the lower arm we have the radius, which is the bone on the outside. And then we have, I messed up here, the radius, which is the bone on the outside, and the ulna, which is the bone on the inside. Okay, so that covers the skeletal structures. Now let's move on and talk about the muscles. Starting with the coracoid process, and then running to the upper third of the humerus, we have a muscle which is called the coracobrachialis. This is a muscle that is mostly not visible unless the arm is lifted. So it plays a really prominent part in depictions of Christ on the cross. Whenever you see Christ's arms splayed out, you're going to see this really long muscle running from inside the shoulder to, I would say, in between the tricep and the bicep. Then the coracobrachialis at the halfway point on the humerus starts bulging to the front, becoming really, really large, and turning into the brachialis muscle. So brachialis is really, really wide and actually forms the majority of the contour of the arm in the upper part. And then it inserts into the ulna, right here. So that's going to be your brachialis muscle. And then on top of this, you have your biceps. So I'm going to change colors a little bit. Hopefully this is clear. The biceps also start at the coracoid process right here, and they have two separate heads. The first one, called the long head, runs along the coracobrachialis, and then, let's do this, starts to bulge out like this, and then inserts itself into the top of the radius. The shorter head wraps over the top of the humerus and then starts running straight down like this. So they form one individual mass, but there are two separate muscles there, the biceps brachii. So hopefully by separating out the layers you can see this a little bit more clearly. So here is your brachialis muscle, and then on top you have your biceps brachii. What else are you seeing in the upper arm? Well, muscles that we've already seen. We have our deltoid. Let's change colors even more. Our deltoid runs on the outer third of the scapula. Here's our deltoid, like this, attaches to the acromion process, and inserts at the deltoid tuberosity that we were just mentioning. Here's your deltoid. And then we have the pectoralis major muscle that's going to run this way, like this. Right, these are muscles that sit on top of the biceps and the brachialis. They overlap. Muscles of the lower arm are considerably more complicated than the muscles of the upper arm because we have individual muscles that move the fingers, muscles that move the hand, and then also muscles that rotate the arm. I'm going to try to simplify it for you as much as possible. We have a series of muscles that start at the medial epicondyle, bulge mostly on the inside of the arm along the ulna, like this, and then run to the middle of the wrist. These are muscles that are responsible for flexing the fingers, so creating a grip, bending the palm of the hand upward, so flexing the wrist. Those are your flexor group muscles. So there's a large number of them. We've got deep muscles, the flexor digitorum, flexor pollicis longus, then we have a middle layer, and then we have ultimately a superficial layer. But all of them, for the most part, run from the medial epicondyle to the middle of the wrist, your flexor group. On the outside of the forearm, on the lateral side, we have a muscle which is called the brachioradialis. So let's see if we can make that as clear as possible. I'm going to change colors on you. What should we use? Okay, let's use a bright red. Let's use this. Okay, so the brachioradialis actually starts in the lower third of the humerus. So if we can get rid of these guys here. Here is the brachioradialis muscle. So it's going to start in the lower third of the humerus. It basically bulges in between the upper and lower arm, like this, and then attaches itself to the styloid process of the radius. So this is a muscle that's going to sit underneath, behind the brachialis muscle and your biceps. So if we put this on, okay, that's going to sit on top, and then our biceps is going to sit on top of that, if that makes sense. Then we have a couple of other muscles. Well, first let me label the brachioradialis. That's going to be F, like this. Then we have another little bump right behind the brachioradialis, which is a muscle with a really long name, the extensor carpi radialis longus. So that's going to be a muscle that sits behind the brachioradialis. Let's get rid of the brachioradialis. No, let's keep it. And let's put just a darker value here. A secondary bump right about here. This is a muscle that we're going to talk about later. This is your extensor carpi radialis longus. Now sometimes you can see another little bump behind there, which is the extensor carpi radialis brevis. So your extensor carpi muscles, your group, you can kind of link these together. So that's going to be G and H. And then there's usually a little bump towards the end of the wrist right here, which is your abductor pollicis longus. This muscle pulls on the thumb, so it influences, lifts the ball of the thumb. Your abductor pollicis longus, so that's going to be letter I. Okay, hopefully this anatomy lesson was a little bit clearer than last time through the use of layering. There's a few little muscles that we didn't cover, but they're mostly visible from the back. For instance, this little bump right here, those are your triceps muscles, and this mass on the inside, also your triceps. So we're going to cover that when we talk about the back of the arm coming up next. Let's talk about the anatomy of the arm from the back. We have features that we've seen before. We have the scapula. We have the scapular spine. We're missing the acromion process. That's the end of the collarbone here, the acromion. What else? We have the glenoid cavity, the shoulder socket. That's going to be number 3. We have the humerus bone, which is number 4. Then we have our two epicondyles. We have the medial epicondyle, the one on the inside, and the lateral epicondyle, the one on the outside. Then we have our two bones of the lower arm, the inside bone, which is the ulna, and the outside bone, which is the radius. Now, we also have some additional features that are not so visible from the front. We have the elbow bone, which is called the olecranon, which is part of the ulna, the very top part. So that is the olecranon, number 9, right here, the elbow bone. And then a bump on the pinky side, which is called the styloid process of the ulna. That's going to be an important landmark when we start seeing the arm pronate and supinate, meaning rotate up and rotate down. Okay, so that covers our skeletal structures, skeletal landmarks. Now let's talk about the muscles. The muscles on the back of the upper arm are relatively simple. The back of the arm is dominated by the tricep group. We have 3 muscles. All of them start at the very top of the humerus and end up at the olecranon. So on the inside, we have a muscle that looks like this. That's the medial head of the tricep. That creates this curvature right here. That's our medial head. On the other side, we have the lateral head. So that's going to run to right about here. And usually, the tricep on the lateral head is going to bulge to about the halfway point on the humerus, and then it's going to turn into tendon, and that tendon's going to run into the olecranon. So we have the lateral head. Here's number 1. Then we have, the medial head, that's number 1. The lateral head, that's number 2. Now on top of this, we have the long head. So let me switch colors a little bit. Hopefully this is clear for you guys. The lateral head also starts at the top of the humerus and then bulges to about 2/3 of the way down on the inside of the arm, where it connects to the medial head and then attaches itself to the olecranon. There's also a little separate attachment, a tail, that runs from just below the glenoid process and attaches this way. Just an additional attachment point. What else? Well, we have muscles we've talked about before. So on top of this, let's see if we can go a little bit lighter. We have our deltoid that runs on top. So it sits all the way along the scapular spine here and inserts at the side of the arm. We have our deltoid. Okay, now let's talk about the muscles of the lower arm. Now, here things get complicated once again because we have individual muscles that extend the fingers, that extend the palm of the hand, or the back of the hand. We have rotating muscles. But I'm going to try to simplify it for you guys. We have a series of muscles that originate at the radius and end at the ulna. So these muscles are going to run right about here, like this. At the wrist, they turn into tendon and then fan out towards the fingers to be able to control the fingers. This is your extensor group. Again, a very large number of muscles. We have deep muscles, we have middle layer muscles, we have superficial muscles. Most of them sit on the outside of the arm, and most of them bulge in the upper half of the forearm, your extensor group. Let me make that see a little bit clearer here. Oh. See, your extensor group. we can see a little bit of the flexors. These are muscles that we talked about from the front of the arm. So the ulna separates the extensors from the flexors. So these bulges of muscles, let's see if I can use a different color here. These muscles on this side are your flexors. The flexor group. The ulna separates the flexors from the extensors. The flexors sit on the inside of the arm in front. The extensors sit on the outside, on the back of the arm, towards the outside. A little bit of a difficult situation, but we'll get it. Okay, so on top of this, we have our very long named, very long muscles. We have our brachioradialis, which is only visible a little tiny bit, and then our extensor carpi radialis longus and extensor carpi radialis brevis. Let's see if we can move up a little bit. Let's go change the color. Let's make it white. Okay, so where is the brachioradialis? Well, it starts in the lower third of the humerus, right about here, like this, and then it disappears into the front of the arm. So mostly from the back, you can't see the brachioradialis. There's a little tiny bump right here. That's going to be your brachioradialis muscle. Mostly what you're seeing are your two extensor carpi radialis muscles. This one, the extensor carpi radialis longus, let's keep switching colors. Let's go back to our dark red here. Starts at the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and then starts running along the side of the arm and attaches to the tendons of the thumb. That's going to be your extensor carpi radialis longus, E. And then, just below it, also attaching itself to the lateral epicondyle, you have the extensor carpi radialis brevis. That muscle runs more or less straight. It's going to run straight like this way, and then also attaches to the inside of the arm, like that. So we have the extensor carpi radialis brevis, F. Just below it, you start having your extensor group. Now, there's a series of muscles. They're not always visible individually, but usually what you can see is a band of two muscles. Let's indicate them in black. You're going to see a band of muscle, which is the extensor carpi radialis longus. Then you're going to see another band, which is the extensor carpi radialis brevis. And then you're going to see a really important anatomical feature. That's the lateral epicondyle of the radius. It's a little bump. So that landmark is really, really important. It lines up with the medial epicondyle. We're going to talk about it when we start dealing with the rotation of the arm. Okay, so hopefully that was a little bit clear by separating out the different muscle groups. What else do I need to tell you? Okay, well, we're missing one little feature here towards the front of the wrist. That's your abductor pollicis longus muscle, the one that controls the ball of the thumb. Let's see if we can change colors here. And your adductor pollicis longus is going to be a muscle that originates from the radius and then turns to the tendon and attaches itself to the ball of the thumb, like this. Okay, let's talk about the anatomy of the arm from the outside. Let's start once again with the skeletal structures. We have the scapula. We have the famous scapular spine, which is right here. We've got the coracoid process, that little bump right there, from which the brachialis and the biceps originate. We have the clavicle. So 3, and the clavicle is going to be 4. The humerus, the bone of the upper arm. Then we have the lateral epicondyle, which is the outside bottom part of the humerus, our lateral epicondyle. Then we have the two bones of the lower arm. Outside bone is the radius, and then the inside bone is the ulna. Now, I want everyone to pay attention to the position the starting and ending point of these two bones. Notice that the radius starts a little bit lower and starts thin, and then ends up a little bit lower and then ends up really wide. The reverse happens for the ulna. It starts a little further up and is relatively wide up here, like this, and then ends up a little bit higher than the radius and ends up really, really thin. So the bones in some ways flip positions. They're not perfectly lined up. Also notice that the ulna from this position is slightly behind the radius. So the radius sits a little bit further forward on the outside of the arm. These kind of misalignments are going to be important when placing your anatomy later. Okay, let's start off with the brachialis muscle, which starts at the coracoid process, is really thin in the upper half, where it's the coracobrachialis, and grows really thick in the lower half of the humerus, here, and inserts itself at the ulna, like that. Now on top of that, we have our biceps. Our biceps also start at the coracoid process. Let me change colors here a little bit. Let's go a little bit brighter. So those muscles sit on top of the brachialis and insert into the radius like this. Then on the back of the arm, we have our triceps muscles. Let's start off with the medial head, which originates at the top of the humerus and then runs all the way down to the olecranon like this. That's the medial head. Then on top of the medial head, we have the long head. Let's change colors a little bit. Let's go a little bit brighter. Also originating at the top of the humerus, and then working its way down to the lower third of the humerus like this. Turning into tendon and then attaching itself to the olecranon. Then in front, on top of our long head and our medial head, we have the long head. Let's change colors again. Let's go a lot brighter. Also starting at the very top of the humerus, but bulging only to the halfway point. Bulging only to the halfway point here. Then turning into tendon and attaching once again to the olecranon. So hopefully that's clear. Let's see if we can eliminate these one by one. So here is your long head, which is sitting in front of, that's your lateral head, which is sitting on top of the long head which is sitting on top of the medial head. Okay, so let's get these back. Okay, now there are muscles that are sitting directly in between the tricep and the bicep. They separate those two muscle groups. The first one is your deltoid. So deltoid, we've already seen. Let's put another thing on top, and let's go even brighter. Okay, so from the side view, you can see three distinct parts of the deltoid. We can see the anterior portion of the deltoid, which runs along the clavicle, like this. We can see the lateral portion, which sits directly on the side here, like this. And then we can see the posterior portion, which runs all the way along the scapular spine, like this. Your deltoid muscle. Now, the other separation between the triceps and the biceps is lower down, right here, the brachioradialis muscle, which is going to, let me change colors here, start in the lower third of the humerus, here, like this. Then turn into tendon once it starts nearing the halfway point of the forearm and attaching itself to the styloid process of the radius, little bump at the very end of the radius bone. That's going to be your brachioradialis. So I know we haven't labeled these muscles yet. The deltoid is going to be 1. The triceps. Here actually you can see that the triceps are a little bit wider here, right? The long head is a little bit bulgier. That's going to be number 2, your triceps with the 3 heads. Your brachialis muscle, that's going to be 3, like this. We've got our biceps, that's going to be 4. Now the brachioradialis, which is going to be 5, like this. Now this is an important anatomical detail. You can see that both the deltoid and the brachialis separate the front of the arm from the back of the arm. So a simplification would be a cylinder, looks like this, with 2 wedges through it. Here and here. The top wedge is the deltoid, the bottom wedge is your brachioradialis muscle. And then on one side we have 2 bundles of muscles, our biceps and our brachialis. And on the back you also have 2 distinct shapes. You have the lateral head of the tricep and then one long line that represents both the long head and the medial head in the back. This is simplification, but it's a good mnemonic device that'll help you when you're actually drawing this particular area. Okay, let's keep talking about the muscles of the lower arm. Directly behind the brachioradialis, we have our very long muscles with very long names, the extensor carpi radialis longus and the extensor carpi radialis brevis. Don't be fooled, both are long muscles. So even though something's labeled brevis doesn't mean that it's not particularly long. These muscles originate in the epicondyles of the humerus and then run all the way down the sides this way. So that's going to be your 6 and 7. I'm not going to try to separate them right now. The extensor carpi radialis longus and the brevis. Now, in the front of the arm, towards the inside, we have our flexor group right here. So I'm going to change colors a little bit here. Let's do this. The flexor group, which is going to be running more or less on the ulna, on the inside, bulging in the upper half, turning into tendon towards the wrist, and then controlling the action of the fingers, right? The flexion of the fingers, the flexion of the palm of the hand. We've got our flexor group right here, like this. And then we can see a little bit of the extensor group. So the very last set of muscles here behind the extensor carpi radialis brevis is your extensor group. That's going to be number 8, number 9. And lastly, our abductor pollicis longus, which is a muscle that controls the thumb. That's going to be number 10. Okay, now that we've suffered through the anatomy of the arm from the front, the back, and the side, now let's deal with a very complicated situation that occurs when the arm starts to rotate, going from palm up to palm down. Now let's talk about what happens to the arm under different rotations. We have supination, where the palm is facing towards us. We have demipronation, where the thumb is facing towards us. Pronation, where the back of the hand is facing towards us. And then forced pronation, where the pinky is facing towards us. Supination is a somewhat unnatural viewpoint, but is really useful for anatomy charts because all the muscles and all the bones are perfectly aligned. You do see it sometimes when someone is lifting a table or a barbell. Otherwise, it's an unusual angle from which to see the arm. Demipronation is probably the most natural. That's what happens to the arm when it's hanging at a relaxed state. So that one's really, really common, kind of arms to the side. Pronation is another slightly artificial viewpoint, but also occurs when somebody is either holding something or has their hand in their lap. So for instance, just resting their hand this way, like this. So either on an armchair or their lap. That happens quite often. Pronation. Forced pronation is probably the most unnatural viewpoint and actually rarely occurs by accident. It's something that's a little bit hard to hold, so you find that if you put your arm into forced pronation, you'll actually start injuring, hurting your rotator cuff. Puts pressure there, and you'll immediately be forced to rotate backwards. But you do see models doing it sometimes because that kind of twist is very, very dramatic. Okay, let's pop up our skeleton. So you can see that under supination, the bones of the lower arm are in perfect alignment. So the radius is going to be in green, that's the bone on the outside. The ulna is going to be in yellow, that's the bone on the inside. They're going to run perfectly parallel to each other, like this. So the radius starts on the outside and ends on the outside, lining up with the thumb. The ulna starts on the inside and ends on the inside and ends at this really important landmark, which I've placed the red dot on, which is called the styloid process of the ulna. We're going to watch for that anatomical landmark because it's going to help indicate where the end of the ulna is. In demipronation, the radius starts on the outside and then starts rotating along with the thumb towards the front of the form. So we're going to see the radius in the bottom in front, and then the ulna is going to rotate from inside the elbow to directly behind the radius. So we're not going to be able to see that little bump, the styloid process. I do have a little dot there to indicate its location. But mostly on the bottom, the ulna is completely obscured by the head of the radius. Now there is a little bit of engagement in the upper arm, in the humerus. You're going to see a little bit of rotation inwards, so that the insertion point of the bicep is going to move a little bit from the center here to a little bit towards the inside. In pronation, there's a complete crossover of the radius from the outside to the inside on the bottom. And then the ulna also does a full rotation. So it's going to start on the inside here, then rotate underneath and pop out on the outside. And you're going to see this little bump, the styloid process of the ulna. Styloid process, let me write that, of ulna. So that's going to be right here and right here. The styloid process of the ulna. You're going to see it pop out on the other side. Now, there is also a little bit more engagement in the upper arm. So you're going to see that the humerus rotates slightly more inwards, so that the insertion point of the bicep is going to be a little bit further over than it would be in demipronation. And then in forced pronation, we see the ulna in its entirety. So the the olecranon, the elbow bone, is going to pop out on the other side, and we're going to see the full length of the ulna running straight down to the pinky, and we're going to see the styloid process of the ulna very, very, very clearly. Now the radius in this case is going to be exactly the opposite of where it was in demipronation. So instead of being fully from the front, we're not going to see it at all. It's going to be almost completely obscured by the ulna. Let's pop up our muscle chart. As you can see, in supination, all the muscles are in perfect alignment. We see the biceps directly from the front. It's going to insert right in the middle of the arm. And then the median furrow, that's an important landmark that separates our flexor group here from our brachialis and our extensor carpi digitorum longus and brevis. That medial furrow, that separation, is going to run straight down to the palm of the hand. So this is why supination is very useful for muscle charts, because there's no confusion at all, there's no twist, everything's absolutely perfectly aligned. Now, notice that the brachialis starts on the outside, follows the length of the radius, and attaches itself in the thumb. The extensor carpi digitoris longus does as well. So those two muscles are going to run perfectly straight under supination. In demipronation, We have a little bit of rotation, as you can see in the upper arm. So you can see the insertion point of the bicep moves a little bit more towards the inside. Our brachialis muscle starts on the outside. You can see a little bit more of the tricep. You can see that the upper arm is a little more in 3/4 view, and that the brachioradialis follows the thumb, and you start seeing a little bit of twist in the muscles. You start seeing a little bit of rotation. And you can start seeing the extensors, which were fully hidden in supination, start coming out from the outside here. So you're going to see a little bit of the extensors. What else? The flexors start wrapping to the inside of the arm. You're going to start seeing less of them. What else can I tell you? The median furrow. This median furrow, the separation between the flexors and your brachialis and your extensor carpi radialis longus, it's going to start to move a little bit. So whereas it starts from the middle here, ends in the middle, here it's going to start a little bit over, and then it's going to start twisting. You're going to see a little bit of an angle to it. So one thing to keep in mind is that the muscles under demipronation, pronation, forced pronation have this kind of spiral quality to them. In supination, everything runs more or less parallel. Okay, so let's talk about pronation. We have a lot of twist here. So you can see that the upper body, the upper arm, is almost in 3/4 view. Look at where the insertion point of your deltoid is. That separation between the bicep brachialis and the tricep muscle. So the brachialis is going to start on the outside, and then it's going to start wrapping around the arm, and then running along the length of the side of the arm and ending at the thumb here. We're going to see a lot of the extensors. So the extensor group is going to be very, very highly visible from the pronator view, the pronation view. And then we start seeing a little bit of the flexors. So they were on this side before in demipronation. They're going to start peeking out a little bit on the outside in the pronation rotation. And then in forced pronation, we have a tremendous amount of twist. So the upper arm is going to be forced into almost a sideways view. You can see the insertion point of the deltoid here. It's almost facing us directly. Your brachialis is going to start right in the front of the arm, and we have a tremendous amount of twist. Look at the spiraling, twisting action of the muscles. Because the brachialis and the extensor carpi digitorum longus attach to the thumb, they're going to wrap around and then completely disappear. You're not going to be able to see them at all. And the extensors start disappearing partially as well. So the extensors are in dark green here, in here. The extensors are going to start wrapping around and disappearing. And you're going to see the full length of the ulna. There's going to be a groove there. And you're going to see a lot of the flexors on this side appearing. Okay, that's what happens to the arm under different rotations. Now let's see what this actually looks like in observation. We're going to move to working from an actual model and then overlaying our drawings with a layer of anatomical landmark and anatomy.